you so
Morning,
much.
Don.
Good morning. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this interview. Appreciate your time, and I'm sure what will be a great interview. Let's begin a little bit, or begin by situating you a little bit in time and space. So the first question for you is, when and how did you first become involved in the disability rights movement in Newfoundland and Labrador?
I guess I came with certain ideas that appealed to the organization that I work for still, and I guess I've been here ever since. Yeah, I think it was a part of a wide collaboration between community, between people in government, people in leadership positions in community, individuals and families connected to the closure of the institutions, and in this case particularly Exxon House. And if people were coming back to communities, people reasonably would ask, well, what are people going to do in communities? And the concept of people having employment came up as being a logical step to take place. So I think the closure of the institutions and the formation of the Bay St. George Community Employment Corporation as really a national pilot project to demonstrate that people with disabilities had a rightful place in the workforce and needed opportunities for social development and also to be just widely included in the community, and of course to make money.
Right. Okay. So you come back to Bay St. George to be the manager of an employment agency, an employment program, for lack of a better word. Many people would have done that and delivered that maybe very appropriately and never become involved in the broader activism, advocacy movement. So the question is, why you see yourself needing to or being compelled to sort of take that step beyond just direct service delivery into something a little broader? What was the genesis to that?
Well, I think when you look at how you're going to approach the task of finding jobs for people who were at the time labeled unemployable. So we were talking about people who faced significant barriers, partially as a result of disability, but significantly as a result of having been in institutions, having been abused and neglected and so on. It's not at the time people talked about that challenge as being like the 5 steps to getting past the receptionist to talk to the boss, and we were saying no, that's not the right point of entry here. Like that there are lots of things happening within communities, community self-management, organizations like chambers of commerce, regional development boards, other organizations like that shared similar values like community living, community education, independent living. All of these people follow generally the same creed, the same set of principles that reinforce the idea of inclusion and diversity, opportunity, equality rights, etc. So I guess it wasn't too long before we were starting to gather success. Within 6 months, we had probably influenced the national employment statistics, and we were in a electoral district, not electoral district, but a federal district that had a 26% unemployment rate. So it had the highest unemployment rate in Canada. So it wasn't difficult to connect an opportunity between the idea that you were working with a constituency that were the most marginalized in the labor force in a region or set of communities that had the highest unemployment rate in the country, that there was an opportunity to think more broadly and to market this idea to other communities, which we ultimately did. I think we probably will get into it, but there were certain developments that took place, particularly as we started to help people with small business, where we started to realize that rights-based issues were significantly important if people were going to expand their horizons and take up their rightful place, and we'll probably get there.
Okay, that's a good segue to the next sort of comment/question. I mean, clearly I know, and most people who know you know, that you've been recognized for your advocacy and contributions in the area of employment, but clearly that's not been your sole focus over the years. So, setting here is what were the other areas of focus that you were addressing?
You know, in some part, I think that the experience around employment was that, you know, people with more significant disabilities were systematically excluded from programs in the United States, and where there were programs in Canada. And of course, there were many people who were still in sheltered workshops where people were training for the job they were never going to get for 20 cents an hour, and the average amount of time that people spent there was 20 years. But so it was it wasn't very long before, you know, national organizations and so on, and universities and whatever came calling, and the invitations sort of to speak to conferences and to come to communities to help them with the establishment of supported employment in particular came about. More specifically, I think the first steps or the first challenge that came about in a meaningful way was around the efforts to promote self-employment, when we ran into issues that people who had significant intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities or mental health issues or whatever could sometimes be, depending on the level of severity of disability, could be forbidden from entering into contracts. Now, ultimately, we came up with an idea around Ken Call, which is a really well-known example, and it has been, you know, he's been on CBC National, he's been on BBC, he's been in magazines with 3.5 million people reading those magazines. But what we did was we incorporated around him so that he was the owner of the company, but the company was its own entity. So in some respects, we had created some ideas around supported decision-making as early as 1990, if you like, and subsequently incorporated that into the collective agreement language around the right to decide, which was reinforced by the idea that a person could utilize supported decision-making. It came about as a result of the stuff that we were doing in small business, and so on. So that sort of puts you into a slightly different conversation, and I was invited as a result of some of those inquiries and experiences that we had to sit on the 1992 task force, which started out as being the alternatives to guardianship, because, as you know, People First of Canada called for an end to guardianship in 1991, and then that committee morphed into supported decision-making as opposed to an alternative to guardianship, to change the title and the early thinking process around what decision-making supports, or equal, which is the equivalent of equal protection and benefit under the law, would apply to people with disabilities. And that is, to this day, I guess, my most enduring passion, is to see before I leave this mortal coil that those legal reforms come to pass, and the promise of the Charter, equality rights, actually comes into being around all people.
And Ray, Ray, the decision-making legal reform efforts that you were involved in, and I think still are involved in, these weren't focused in Bay St. George or focused provincially. This was, talk a little bit about who you work with, what organizations, because I think this is both national and international practice as well, right?
Yes. Yes, well, I think, some of the early efforts in Canada supported the efforts under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and specifically Article 12, which is this notion that all people have legal capacity, almost as as a right of birth. The issue is some people will have difficulty exercising that right unless you acknowledge supports and accommodations for people. So I may know, like I have a daughter who has significant intellectual disability. I know intensely what her will and preferences would be on many issues. And so does her mother, and so do other people that know her. And our challenge in this process, I guess, is to find a legal path to give expression to that as an alternative to forcing people to live outside of the systems altogether, like not be able to make personal decisions or financial or medical-based decisions, or create an acknowledgement under the law that people make decisions interdependently, and we are going to recognize that people who have those loving, trusting supports should be able to use those as currency to make legally binding decisions. So that is, by definition, international, because, first of all, the UN Convention is international. The expertise is international, and we have been working, very specifically with the national disability groups, very strong provincial steering committee process committed to this in the long term, and we continue to press for that. So it's a very important issue that maybe a lot of people haven't heard a lot about, but I think it's going to be increased in prominence, particularly because it's getting harder and harder for people to navigate communities because of things like privacy legislation and so on, where one time maybe a person could have a parent or a spouse or somebody call and say, I'm wanting to appeal the fact that I've been cut off from the disability tax credit. But really, what happens more increasingly today is they would say to the spouse or to the parent, who are you? And of course, and then when they say, well, we can't talk to you because, we can only talk to the individual. So this kind of leaves people in a kind of, in a state where they're not really possessing the full benefits of being a citizen, the ability to have, liberty and freedoms and to be free from discrimination. So I guess going back to our first comments around the supported employment piece, it was at dawn of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I would argue that the promise of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and sections that speak to equality rights had not been fully realized, and that the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is very useful in providing that lens to support, I think, not constitutional reform in the country, but acknowledgement by the courts that the proposed regime that we're talking about helps to bring the equality rights provisions of our charter to life for people. If I might just say one more thing on it, is that the UN Convention doesn't confer any new rights on people, but I think the point is that the rights that exist for all people within Canada are not being realized by a large constituency of people who have issues, like for instance dementias or people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities, mental health. They're stepping on people's fundamental rights, and that current legal regime is not constitutional.
Ray, I want to circle back for just a second and pick up on something you mentioned, which I know, but maybe many people don't know. You're a parent of a child with a disability. Just wondering, Ray, did that status, did it impact on the kinds of areas that you focused on, either individually or collectively, and or did it somehow sustain your involvement in the movement over the years from a parent
Yes,
perspective?
I think the answer is yes. I think also, though, in some cases, as I look forward in the next bunch of years, I think I recognize that in the ability that I had when I was younger to be able to do a lot of the things and travel and do those kinds of things are somewhat limited because of caregiving responsibilities and what have you. But I think the whole concern about the status of people as persons, the whole notion of personhood, are people being respected fully in all dimensions of personhood, would cause any parent concerns that they might have to resort to petitioning the court to declare your son or daughter a non-person in the face of the law in order to be able to get an MCP card or to be able to access medical records. So there's a certain indignance, I suppose, about that reality under the law. The other thing, which is a whole area that I'm also responsible for, in terms of my volunteer work, if you like, is the whole idea of future planning, and which came about, I think we started in the late 90s. And I want to emphasize the point again, Don, it says that nobody does anything alone. Like, if you think that you're doing it alone, you're thinking wrongly. That collaborative relationships and respect for the fact that it takes a lot of people and a lot of cooperation and shared values and whatever to change some of the stuff at the levels that we're talking about. But most particularly in the isolation and poverty that people face, there's been too little recognition of the implications of people losing primary caregivers. Whether it be a spouse or a parent or whatever, that we're seeing more and more people start to bleed back into institutional living because of the passing or the inability of a primary caregiver to continue to provide the supports that they always have. The replacement of those supports is a huge thing that we don't believe families can really take on, nor can we expect fully government to be able to respond to the needs of 24/7 types of situations for so many people. It's just not realistic. So I think within a context of drawing out a document that perhaps we both participated in unison, which was a federal, provincial, and territorial guide to what programs and supports and services for people should look like. It identified that the citizenship was the most important thing, and that people needed employment, and people needed income, and people needed disability supports, but that the achievement of equality and well-being, safety, and security in the community depends upon a lot of players. It depends upon the shared responsibility was the term that they used. So a lot of what I've been doing with individuals individuals and families and organizations in the province is bringing to light the options that are available, first of all, to help build options, but for supportive living arrangements and how people might do advanced planning, like taking advantage of programs like the Registered Disability Savings Program, the support trusts, having a will, having trusts set up in the will, having living wills, having all, the ducks lined up, but also, I think, on a generational basis, a recognition by young families that expecting that government is going to take care of people, as the expression that most people would use, is going to be a disastrous outcome, and that the government may take care of people, but what that quality of life is going to look like for people is going to be really questionable. So I do feel that this is an important step in making sure that we limit and ideally eliminate the idea of the repatriation of people through the back door back to institutions and end-of-life facilities, personal care homes, nursing homes, those sorts of things. And I don't know of anybody that I'm connected with that's not deeply concerned about that, that doesn't feel in some respects that we're not moving ahead on that, we're moving backwards.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, take 15 seconds and look back over the last 30 or 40 years, just wondering, what would you consider, what would you identify perhaps as some of the major achievements or highlights of your efforts over the years? And I'm sure there have been many.
Well, I think, that the establishment of supported employment and I think the value space associated with providing dignified and respectful supports to people. I obviously can't list all of the people that I would like to, but I would point out that Dolores Flynn was an extremely influential person to me, and I think she helped shape a view of what dignified supports were for people and how to help represent people in the community. Arguably, we don't spend much time talking about that anymore, and I think that we probably ought to, because I think service systems have maybe become too powerful in people's lives. But still, for all, I think the fact that it has grown into a situation where maybe 600-700 people a year are participating through the supported employment program, plus all of the other work that we did with, Canadian Labour Force Development Board, with the Roar Institute, with lots of others to create a vision that people could be, participating in the workforce. One of the things that I think wouldn't be commonly known about, like, my involvement is that for the first 15 years or so that I was involved, I spent quite a bit more time working with people as a representative of community living, not necessarily working with community living. So I spent a lot of time working with Mary Reid, Joanne McDonald, with Marie Ryan, with lots of different people, Laurie Beachel at the national level, various researchers and policy people who I tended to gravitate to because you could have conversations about where from here. But most of my efforts, I think in the early years, the first 15 years or so, were more on a cross-disability platform. And I spent 7 years, as an example, on the Canadian Labour Force Development Board process, which had 26 national organizations of persons with disabilities as a part of that process. I think, when it's all said and done, I am hopeful that the supported decision-making piece will be realized. In which case, that will be very significant. Almost like, it is even more complicated, as an example, than it was to have women become people under the law. Like before, it was sort of let's decide to let women be people. But in the issue around legal capacity and so on, you're challenging some of the foundations of the way that the law was built at a time when people with disabilities were considered as being not fully human. So naturally, that's crucially important. And I hope that in time, that the whole issue of poverty and isolation will be alleviated greatly by the recognition that the way out of poverty is for people to have assets and to have significant assets, and that there is a true cost to disability that's not recognized by government, and that it is that the last vestiges of welfare system need to disappear, and we need a different platform which recognizes that how important it is that the Article 19 of the UN Convention, the right to live in the community, is something that gains currency again in terms of a fundamental human right. There was a real magic about the early years in the 1980s, where people, just again coming off of the equality rights aspects of the Charter of Rights Freedoms, and the closure of institutions, and battling things like disincentives to employment and all those things. But there was many people involved in that, and you found support through, from ministers, from senior staff in government, were very collaborative with communities. It was a time of innovation and creativity. For instance, the court challenges program at one point in time was terminated by a previous administration, was since restored. The relationship between advocacy and government has changed significantly. So it turns out I'm sort of a believer that insofar as it is possible, you want to have a collaborative relationship with government, and I think those opportunities still exist. But the days of going out there and making a media splash and that sort of thing, one, there are significant barriers to doing that, and secondly, the effectiveness of those strategies is called into question. So we just have to be a bit more creative about putting that story out there all the time. I certainly wouldn't want to be misinterpreted to suggest that people should be less vocal, or arguably people should have been more vocal and aggressive over the years, because the disability constituency, I think, is greatly underrepresented in public affairs.
Ray, as you probably know better than most, that advocacy, activism is tough work, but I think we both agree it's also rewarding and enjoyable most of the time, or at least at some times. Just wondering, do you have any positive experiences, fun times, fun people that you might want to share?
I think that there are millions of such stories. I think that what I could say is that I have a profound respect for most of the people that I know the best within this province and across the country, just simply for how hard people work. unbelievable, really. That you just watch people go from one thing to the next, and the commitment, and then up to the row on the computers, doing proposals and all this sort of stuff. Like the enormity of the work and the quality of the work by the leaders within the disability constituency is just astonishing. I would say that. I would also say that in younger years, people would work hard but would also play hard. Yeah. Now, there's one story I can remember back from, I wasn't really prepared for this question, but one time we were in a retreat in Georgia at a school in October, and while we were in the school, the person or people that were there didn't realize that outside there was a storm happening, right? So it was about 2 feet of snow, and people had shoes and no coats or anything. So it ended up that everybody moved to Stephenville Hotel. That was the idea, but we ended up in a private residence because we got stuck there. But myself and a couple of other people, two ladies, we ended up in a taxi, and the ultimate outcome of this was that Dolores ended up driving the taxi. Myself and a person that we supported were pushing the taxi, and the taxi driver was in the back seat blowing on his hands. So, now there's lots of stuff going on in terms of funny things that happened. I don't want to embarrass anybody.
Yeah, especially yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, fair enough. 2020, things better now than they were in 1980, 1975? Things worse? Are they better or worse? How so, in your opinion?
It's a complicated question to me. I think that those exciting, vibrant times are maybe a little less exciting and vibrant in terms of like there being this massive effort to make things happen for people with disabilities and to address the poverty and the isolations and things of that nature. So I sort of miss that real enthusiasm that was so widely spread. It still exists, but it doesn't exist in such obvious ways and in such transparent and exhaustive way that it once did. I think that there's a real concern around what happens to people who are living in the community and are at great risk in the near term of no longer living in the community. And for a number of years, we've been seeing people who do not belong, are 35, 40 years old, ending up in end-of-life facilities and personal care homes and things of that nature. And our response to that is, and I don't mean just the disability constituency, our response as a society to that is to virtually ignore the fact that that's happening. So I see positives. I mean, I see that, that at one point in time people were, getting $115 a month, and, you see, dramatically improved, though inadequate, levels of income support, people still living in poverty, but, not as bad as it was perhaps. There are some provisions, limited provisions that could be built upon for people to develop assets and for families to be more broadly supportive. We have, accessibility legislation. A lot of good work has been done by the Disability Policy Office. We have an opportunity, I think, to put supports next to people in communities. Like, community at this point in time has very good, credible ideas. It is astonishing that we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar generational wealth transfer to potentially to people with disabilities, and that there is too little interest on behalf of government to engage community in how we could, possibly make that happen. And I would say that it's a mixed bag. I'd be very interested to know how the other people that you interview respond to that question.
Yeah, and after we'll have to check that out. Just wondering, is there something, looking back again, wait, any one thing that if you could change, you would go back and change it? Like one thing, one battle that you lost, maybe that you'd like to be able to have won? Like, is there one thing that you would like to undo or do better over the last number of years?
In the years before social enterprise was recognized in the way that it currently is, we were trying, we being people within Newfoundland and Labrador and on up to national organizations and what have you. We had a number of major corporate partners like banks, universities, and so on, all coming together with an idea to create effectively a social enterprise in several different areas. And it just simply because it didn't have totally clear or a single purpose type of description about what it is you wanted to do, like what exactly are you trying to do here. That's what we were kind of saying was as well, if you take Northern Telecom, if you take Royal Bank, if you take St. Mary's University, if you take, one of the richest families in the province of Labrador, and you put them all together to a combined purpose to alleviate employment and economic issues for people, and, good things will happen. But unfortunately, we weren't able to communicate that. At one point, I can recall, in the building that I'm sitting here now, David Dingwall came to the building, and my wife used to be one of his constituents. And in the 70s, she was involved in the first effort to build a national child care program. And so she got to know him pretty well, so I said, come on, we're going to the building, because he was at the time head of a co-op. And then later it turned out that the CEO of the co-op was a close friend of somebody else that was involved in community living. And so we had, the minister and the CEO access to both, and sat down and went through the proposal, and it didn't go anywhere. And I think had we gotten there, I think we could have done things like, for instance, address the issue of accessible housing stock. We could have had, a lot of equity built up in a social enterprise over the years. This would have been back in the 90s, in the fairly early 90s as well. And so I resolved out of that, knowing people in power is not always great. Next time we'll start with the janitor.
Yeah, might be a more effective strategy in some cases.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So Ray, we know, or you've confirmed that you're sort of still involved in the advocacy and the activism that you've always been involved in. I guess my question here, or my inquiry is, do you plan on remaining involved at the same level? Are you going to be slowing down, picking up speed?
I think for most people that I have, been most closely aligned with over the years, recognize that it's a life sentence, like it's in your blood. I particularly don't see myself going to sleep on the whole question of citizenship and making sure that people have full respect, full benefit of the law, the full ability to make personal decisions with support if you choose around your own personal life, your own medical processes and treatments, the financial world, like, you know, people, you can have a bank account but you can't access your money. So there's all kinds of weird stuff out there that I don't want to dwell into, but that piece of work it will carry me to my grave. Yeah. I hope to live long enough to see that piece change, and I would argue that these human rights issues, sometimes people think you're going down the wrong track when you're going down human rights, and that, you know, we should be emphasizing more direct, you know, work and supports to individuals and families. But I'm of the belief you have to do all of those things. But I think in particular you cannot build a sound house on a rotten foundation. And if you are going to have a legal framework that does not recognize at this point in time with all of the emphasis and freedoms and inclusion and diversity that have been afforded to populations, and to still have people with disabilities questioning whether or not governments recognize their ability to call upon supports to exercise personhood is just, I don't know, not something that you could resign from, you know what I mean?
Just wondering, how would you summarize, or how would you characterize, perhaps is a better term, your time as an activist, or maybe correctly, your time as a pursuer of equality rights? Maybe that's a better term to apply to you. How would you summarize, characterize your involvement over these, at least one generation, not two?
I guess it's the focus on the big picture, the piece that kind of, well, first of all, one of the things that's unusual about my experiences is that I was acting, you know, the saying, think globally, act locally. Usually if I was at the national level, I was one of the few people who could actually bring the local community experience to things as to, you know, how the impacts would be. And similarly, you know, when I was at a local level, I'd be able to say, well, you know, this is what we've learned at the federal level. So at one point, that was really extremely important to be functioning at all three levels at the same time. The way that decision making has changed, I think it in some respects, you know, draws things back more into a provincial level kind of focus and a local community level focus than before. So I guess I feel that the strategic thinking, the notion of that, you know, think ideas, not moves. Those kinds of ideas, and also I think and I hope the importance of keeping the fundamental values that we share as, you know, central to that. You know, the value for supports and accommodations, the value for diversity and inclusion and acceptance of all people as being full participants, and, you know, like, these are fairly widely shared views by, you know, organizations beyond just the ones that we deal with. And I think to some extent, making some of those unusual marriages to, for instance, lending institutes and stuff like that, are some of the things that that probably expanded the envelope a little bit. That's all that any of us really do.
Do it all again? Would you?
Oh yeah.
I think you hinted at it earlier, that people take much more out of this than you give. Like, there are times when you feel differently, of course, but you know, and the longer term picture, like, it's you know, for many of us, it's been our lives. Like, you know, it's a family, of course, but, you know, and in some cases, the family and the work are, you know, connected, and for independent individuals. But no, I wouldn't choose another privilege, and I think that I could easily say that that I've taken more from it and built understandings and relationships, and it's enriched my life in ways that I would not trade. Kind of like some, like you might regret, as an example, if you have a son or daughter, that it's very likely that our daughter, because of the severity of her disabilities and so on, she'll never be married. However, Kathy and I, we talk about it and we say, it's unfortunate in some respects that, that she has a disability, whatever, but then we turn around and we say that, understanding that disability is natural, don't get me wrong here, but, we probably wish that everybody could have family and whatever, of their own, but, they say, if we're going to change this one piece of Haley, that's our daughter's name, if we're going to change one piece of her, we have to change all pieces of her. And of course, she's a treasure to us and all people, I think, and everybody that I've met through this course of my life with this has been enriching, fully whole persons who give as much as they get to the process. So no, I wouldn't change my path and head to Wall Street or something.
I guess I just want to say that I agree that most of us take more of this than we give. But that then means in your case you must have taken a lot because you've given a lot. Ray, I really want to acknowledge and thank you on behalf of a lot of people in this province and possibly all the citizens for your contribution to the disability movement in this province and to the wider context, both nationally and internationally. Thank you so much. And then to thank you for participating in this interview.
Well, thank you, Don. And similarly, I would acknowledge the contributions that you've made over the years because we've known each other for a very long time.
You referenced earlier that disincentives. Just wondering if you could maybe share with us some of what you saw or what you see as some of the major disincentives to employment.
Yeah, well, for a lot of people with disabilities, there's a connection between income and disability supports that they receive from government. And when people go to work, sometimes they don't get the full benefit of that, the income that they make. And sometimes, as a result of going to work, there's a disconnect to the drug cards and so on. So people have to choose sometimes between those things, right? But even in today's context, after you make $150 a month, if you're reliant upon these systems, they start clawing back the income that you earn from employment at a rate that leaves you working for $2.50 an hour in terms of the net benefit to yourself. In the time frames that we're talking about, it used to be $95 a month. So anything that you made above $95 a month, if you were receiving income or disability supports from government, you would not be able to keep. So that was a tremendous disincentive. So that's what's meant by disincentives, is that it should be connected to the idea that you should be better off to work than not to work. That would be a pretty fundamental concept, right? Almost everybody would agree with that. And in some cases, it only made sense for people to work a few hours in a month before they started to get into a more punitive regime, which was, really kind of connected to the thinking that created the welfare system and the reason why the province created poverty reduction strategies and so on was to try and break the back of that kind of structure. And that has not, we've not arrived there yet.
All right. And Ray, maybe a quick definition for people who are going to listen to this interview, the definition of supported employment, or what do you mean by supported employment, that concept, and also supported housing.
Sure. In terms of supported employment, some people are not able to because of the nature of the disability particularly, are not able to perform employment and compete on a level playing field in the labor force because they don't have the same abilities or say attention to task, or perhaps some aspects of the job might involve say operating the cash register or whatever. So in those cases, supported employment was created with the idea that in order for people to compete in the labor force, that they may need somebody else to work alongside of them, and sort of like a team, and together they accomplish the tasks that employers expect. So basically clears the deck for that there is no reason why somebody with in this case particularly intellectual disability would not be able to participate in the labor force. Other comment I would make about it is that the reason that supported employment was created was because people didn't have the same capabilities to get post-secondary accreditation. Like, so for the mainstream disability constituency, the major concern is how to get access to good, decent jobs, and you do that by gaining access to post-secondary education. For people with intellectual disabilities, that door is closed to people. So that was the reason that supported employment was conceived of, and that's what we're meaning is that sometimes people will actually need somebody dedicated supporting them.
And supported housing?
Supportive housing just really just simply, well, it's not just simple, I suppose, but what we're talking about there is that again, not totally different than supported employment, is that some people are able to live independently with support. So when we're talking about people living in the community, we're not saying that you have to be able to live absolutely independently and not have any support. It may mean that somebody is there for part-time, or in some cases, some people will need 24/7 supports, regardless of what that supportive need is. What we're talking about in supportive living is consideration of the idea that people will live in their own homes, have autonomy, control their environment. It will be home in the way that most people mean it, but in order to achieve that for many people, including seniors population as an example, there is sometimes a need for support. And that is an overall objective, I guess, is to make sure that everybody in one fashion or another can achieve supportive living, even if they're living with families.
And independence doesn't mean without support.
It doesn't matter.